Representative Pramila Jayapal went after Attorney General William Barr over the Justice Department's hypocrisy versus when it comes to the Black Lives Matter protests versus the armed right-wing protests in Michigan. Take a look.
On two separate occasions, after President Trump tweeted, "Liberate Michigan," to subvert stay-home orders to protect the public health of people in Michigan, protesters swarmed the Michigan Capitol carrying guns, some with swastikas, Confederate flags, and one even with a dark-haired doll with a noose around its neck. Are you aware that these protesters called for the governor to be lynched, shot, and beheaded?
No.
You're not aware of that?
I was not aware of it.
Major protests in Michigan. You're the attorney general, and you didn't know that the protesters called for the governor to be lynched, shot, and beheaded. So obviously you couldn't be concerned about that.
Well, there are a lot of protests around the United States, and on June 1st, I was worried about the District of Columbia, which is federal.
In certain parts of the country, you're very aware of those, but when protesters with guns and swastikas and Confederate flags, excuse me, Mr. Barr, this is my time, and I control it.
Damn. All right. I like that. Okay. It's kind of funny how this whole protesting works out when it comes to the right? So if you threaten Democratic governors and you show up with your guns and you're a right-wing conservative, right? I mean, you don't get ignored by Trump, right? He knows exactly what you're doing. No, you actually get elevated. And remember, the president himself, as she mentioned, egged these protesters on by calling them to liberate the states. So to use violence, right? Did they actually do violence? No. But they were prepared to. And so that was an issue, right? And so there were a lot of threats. It got so bad that Michigan's Attorney General, Dana Nessel, actually ended up getting armed protection for this. And so that's interesting. Look, they also, there's pictures, of course, of protesters getting into cops' faces. And so there's that. Now, she's going to continue with this and really kind of show the comparison, the juxtaposition between both of these. Take a look.
You are aware of certain kinds of protesters, but in Michigan, when protesters carry guns and Confederate flags and swastikas and call for the governor of Michigan to be beheaded and shot and lynched, somehow you're not aware of that. Somehow you didn't know about it, so you didn't send federal agents in to do to the president's supporters what you did to the president's protesters. In fact, you didn't put pepper balls on those protesters. So the point I'm trying to make here, Mr. Barr, that I think is very important for the country to understand, is that there is a real discrepancy in how you react as the Attorney General, the top cop in this country, when white men with swastikas storm a government building with guns. There is no need for the president to, quote, activate you because they're getting the president's personal agenda done. But when black people and people of color protest police brutality, systemic racism, and the president's very own lack of response to those critical issues, then you forcibly remove them with armed federal officers, pepper bombs, because they are considered terrorists by the president. You take an aggressive approach to Black Lives Matter protests, but not to right-wing extremists threatening to lynch a governor if it's for the president's benefit. Did I get it right, Mr. Barr?
Yeah, she got it right. Now, obviously, Barr did not agree. So now, here's the thing. I know there's a lot of claims like, you understand, the right wing, they don't do any violence. You guys remember the Bundy clan? The Bundy clan, these are the guys who wanted to let their cattle graze on federal lands, right? So basically they want to be freeloaders and despoil public land because it turns out cattle grazing is actually really damaging towards land. Well, now they literally forced their way and took over federal property and aimed guns at federal agents. Actually, there were also Bundy protesters that Bundy affiliated that actually did engage in a shootout with police. Do you know how they're perceived by the right wing? Heroic. But hey, if you protest mostly peacefully, right, as the vast majority of these protesters in Portland were, against the unjustified murder of black people by the police, state-sanctioned violence, by the way, if you're supporting that, doesn't that make you a bootlicker? I know how they can't seem to square that circle. Like, oh, yes, I'm anti-government. I don't like the big boot of government. Well, but I like it when it's on your neck. Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense. But okay, nonetheless, William Barr, the right, if you're protesting against that state-sanctioned violence, well, you must be a terrorist. Really. So I've talked about this before. A lot of the protesters in Portland, again, activists, but you also have the wall of moms, dads with leaf blowers, veterans, and other people who are fed up with the injustice. Yet Trump called them deranged anarchists. Which, by the way, there's a story that came out today. Some of the property damage, and the right likes to bring this up, right? There was, you remember that I did the story on the Umbrella Man, right? So we didn't know who that guy was, but he was out there breaking windows. Had his umbrella, breaking windows like at an AutoZone or something, and like I was like, who is this guy, and why is he smashing up private property, right? Well, it turns out that guy's a white supremacist. So there are white supremacists that go into these protests and they start fires, they smash windows, and who gets blamed for it? The vast majority of the peaceful protesters. I'm not saying that there never was a protester that was legitimate that was going in there and looting or smashing up private property, but there are instigators that get sent into these as well to stir that up. And so to make, of course, things look bad. And so, of course, that's why you get Trump and the rest of the Republicans saying, well, see, look, they're terrorists. They're terrorists. We're just protecting federal property. By the way, that's the excuse that he used when it came to Portland versus Michigan. Well, we're just defending government property. And there wasn't any government property in Michigan, so we couldn't send in the troops even if we wanted to, right? Sorry, wish we could have helped, but our hands are tied. Were they? Well, at least according to Politico's Zach Stanton, those Michigan protesters were actually about 100 yards away from the Chamberlain Federal Building, which is a federal property. So you could have had a situation where they could have sent in peacekeeping troops to that area, just to make sure that no actual violence were to break out. Because again, there were a lot of threats, and these people were armed. Which again, in the Portland protests, very few people were armed, and so I wonder if William Barr knew that. Now, look, I could forgive him for not actually knowing that particular thing. But one of his staffers could have known. Somebody knew. Somebody could have told him. Although, of course, that wouldn't have made a difference because he wouldn't have cared. This country goes out of its way to excuse right-wing terrorists. Republicans always seem to defend that. Right-wing terror in this country has killed more than Islamic fundamentalist terror, even though, yes, they are a significant issue. But what happened when we basically tried to point out, hey, man, look, we've got these domestic far-right groups that are killing police officers, right? That are endangering people, stockpiling weapons, arms, right? And so, like, what are we going to do about them? We try to investigate them. Republicans complain, and we actually end up deprioritizing them and prioritizing Islamic fundamentalism. Because guess what? That was the narrative for years. Scary Muslims. Got to protect ourselves against the scary Muslims. And yet, you have right-wing anti-government groups that are responsible for anti-police violence. But what are we talking about now? We're talking about Antifa, the Antifers, who are responsible for how many deaths? None. Although, to be fair, the amount of milkshaking and Nazi punching has skyrocketed. And so, I guess that's an issue, right? But it's important to point out the amazing hypocrisy of our federal government that coddles right-wing extremism. I mean, for example, and this isn't really federal, but you want to look at the local police forces, right? Dylan Roof, after he shot and killed 8 African Americans in a church, cops bought him a cheeseburger. And yet, police officers in a different city killed Breonna Taylor as she was sleeping. Tamir Rice died within 12 seconds. Freddie Gray got a nickel ride on his way to jail. Walter Scott was shot in the back as he was running away. Eric Garner was choked out for selling loose cigarettes. George Floyd had a knee on his neck for a bounced check. Do you understand the difference here? Do you understand how our institutions of power tend to favor right wing versus how they treat people of color? Apparently, in this country, you have to, in order to have your First Amendment rights to protest, you've got to be white, heavily armed, and a conservative. Now, if you're, and some people might say, well, you know what? Then the left should get guns too. Actually, it's probably not a good idea. Because, again, even if you have guns, they're not going to respect your Second Amendment rights as a left-winger. I mean, in fact, gun control back in Ronald Reagan's time, the old Black Panthers, not the new ones, but the old Black Panther Party, they're the ones that marched on their state capitals with guns, doing the exact same thing that the right-wing protesters were doing, just coming in, using their Second Amendment rights in order to do protest. And Ronald Reagan passed gun controls restricting them taking their gun rights. And so these right wingers, if you're a leftist, they're going to send the troops. They're going to trample all over your First Amendment rights.